Chapter 1, The Little Leader. My thoughts were fuzzy. Muddled. I couldn't make sense of anything. My vision was fuzzy. I was unable to perceive the world around me. It was all a mess of colors and light. My hearing was fuzzy. An amalgamation of sounds bombarded me, at the same time both a whisper and a roar. My body was fuzzy. With only a vague sense of shape, it was impossible to tell where my body began and ended. I only had a faint sense of self-awareness. I was confused, but not panicked, curious, but still cautious. My sense of time was warped. I was unsure how long I stayed like that, days, years, seconds. But suddenly something started to come into focus. The sense of constantly shifting colors around me started to solidify and take shape. The sounds lessened, I could no longer hear everything, just certain things. That sense of self-awareness became greater the more things came into focus. I was no longer just existing, I was. And then I could see them. They were simple creatures, much like lizards. The first one that caught my attention was a young one using its scaly claws to lift a small rock and slam it down against a dark brown shell resting on a large rock. Lift, whack, lift, whack. Eventually a definitive crack resounded. Then the little lizard creature dropped the small rock, and gobbled up the soft contents that had been protected by the hard protective shell. What a smart little creature! I was captivated by him. Drawn to him. I wanted to help him flourish and grow. I felt myself reach out to the first lizard, now of a breeding age. He was special, and with a little influence could greatly help his colony. The colony was largely autonomous, grouping together for protection from larger enemies, but otherwise staying to themselves. But that wouldn't do. If they didn't come together as a group, they couldn't learn from each other. To the first lizard, I gave the essence of a leader. I don't quite know how I did it. By now I realized I had no physical form, I was simply there. I had no eyes, but I could see, no ears, but could hear. I could not touch the rocks, nor the grass, nor the trees. But I could touch these creatures, touch them in a way that didn't require hands. And it was in that way I touched him, and inspired him to be a leader. The little leader used his knowledge to repeat his success with the shell cracking, over and over. Eventually, he began to teach this art to others who flocked around him. Slowly, they began to mimic the action, and soon the whole colony of little lizards were able to get at the delicious innards of the large nuts and seashells. It was quite beneficial to their society, as they were able to have a stable food source that they didn't have to catch first to consume, which allowed their population to increase. The little leader was quite popular among the ladies, and had no shortage of mates during the breeding seasons. I was saddened when he finally died of old age. He had led a very fulfilled life. Over his lifetime he had brought the colony together as a functioning group. And they learned from him that they could teach others, and that others would teach them. They showed their colony mates where to find food, and dangerous places to avoid. The concept of sharing was created by the little leader, and his legacy lived on in all his children. I would watch his children, and his children's children. I would watch over them until the end of their days. I could not protect them from danger, but I could give them inspiration on how to defend themselves. I could not give them food, but I could tug them in the direction of a rotting log with many bugs to consume. All of my essence seemed devoted to watching these creatures. Wherever they were, I was, and whatever they did, I saw them, heard them. They were my world, and I was very endeared to them. I was not some great and powerful god who could punish with hellfire or reward with rain. I was simply their overseer. Chapter 2, A Far Bigger World. My little lizards had beautiful scales. Had they been in another part of the world, they likely would have stood out too much, and been easy targets for predators. But their dark scales that shimmered with a variety of bright colors in the light mimicked the dark rocky earth of their home by the sea. The dark rock was iridescent, and when the waves would crash upon the shore, it bounced light everywhere, creating a beautiful array of colors. It was a very handy adaptation. There was little dirt, most plants grew out of the depths of the rocks, even the large trees along the shoreline. Most small plants had shallow roots, which made them prime targets for bugs, a favorite food of my lizards. The trees were rooted deep below the rock, and even in great storms they were unlikely to topple once they reached a certain age. Thus my lizards were able to hide from their prey and predators by simply staying still on the rocks. As long as they were patient, they would get their desired outcome. The impatient ones died quickly, usually before their first mating season. And so as the generations went by, less and less impatient lizards were born until it became a rare trait. The prevalent patience was important for ambushing bugs and the small fish that got washed into tidipools along the rocky shore. Those that were not good at hunting could focus on cracking open nuts and seashells thanks to the little leader of generations past. After inspiring the little leader, I had not strongly interacted with them, I was simply content to watch them grow. But then a curious thing happened. I had seen it a few times during the mating seasons, but had largely ignored it. It was like a pinpoint of light that traveled inside a new mother lizard, and they had always been faint, barely noticeable. But this light was different. It was stronger, more vibrant. I wanted to know what it was, and reached for it. I touched it, and it was like a shock. Not like getting zapped by lightning, but more of an unexpected static shock. In getting close enough to touch it, I could all the incredibly faint lights of life that raced to be the first to fertilize the new mother's eggs, racing to be born into the world. The one with the bright light was not as fast, and would likely not make to the eggs in time. So for the first time in a while, I interacted directly with the lizards, and pulled the little light ahead of the myriad of other faint lights. It was pure curiosity. I wanted to see what it would become. The male lizard left after copulating to find another mate, as was usual during the breeding season. The mother would lay her eggs and guard them until they hatched. After the advent of sharing, rather than leaving the young to their own devices once hatched, the usually well-fed mother would now feed her children for a short time until their scales were hard. I watched the strong light as it fertilized the egg. It was then deposited into a hole in the rocks, and covered with foliage by the mother to guard them. The eggs hatched, and the mother fed them as she learned to do from her mother. Their scales became hard, and the burden of motherhood was lifted as the little ones were ready to lead their own lives in the colony. But something was a little different about Strong Light. Her scales were harder than her siblings, and her personality was more aggressive than the other lizards in the colony. She didn't play well with others, but she was adventurous and had nerves of steel. She wasn't reckless and avoided the larger predators, but she was able to hold her ground and scare off smaller predators by hissing, and quickly turning to whip her hardened tail at them to discourage them. Strong Light was brave. She was a warrior. With her exploring farther than the other lizards in the colony, I got to see more of the world. I also realized just how small of an area my little lizards occupied. She made me wonder if it was okay to just be content with the small piece of world my lizards held. She ignited a hunger in me, a hunger to help my lizards achieve newer and greater things. To see new heights and reach new depths. Tragically, her life ended before she could spawn more like herself. Despite her caution, she became cornered by a large predator. She valiantly defended herself, but ultimately was overpowered. Although my sorrow was not as great as it was for the little leader, I still felt hers was a life ended too early. Suddenly I had a goal. These lizards were capable of more than they seemed, they just needed a little help to realize it. If more warriors could be born, they wouldn't have to worry as much about the smaller predators, and could expand their territories and their families. As it was, the region was getting crowded as more of the young survived thanks to the mother's early aid. I looked for Strong Light's parents, and for the next few breeding seasons I pulled them towards each other, hoping for them to mate. The first time, the mother snubbed the male, the second time they copulated, no other Strong Lights appeared. After the fifth breeding season, it finally appeared again. When I touched it, I could feel that this one was male, and I more understood the light and what it meant. This light was not as aggressive as Strong Light's, but perhaps that would work in his favor. For now, I tended to the new light, helped him find an egg to fertilize, then stepped back to watch. Chapter 3, The Role of an Overseer. It worked out much as I had hoped. The younger brother of Strong Light shared her same hard scales, and a fraction of her aggressiveness and adventurousness. I felt tired, much like I needed to sleep, but there was one more thing I felt I needed to do. After he was grown, and his scales fully hardened, I reached out to him. I inspired him to be a defender, much as I had the little leader to lead. I could feel myself slipping away. I had done too much, overexerted myself trying to get the mother and father to copulate on numerous occasions. My consciousness faded, and the swirl of lights and dissonance of sounds returned. Though it would seem chaotic, it was strangely calming. It was like I was connected to everything and nothing all at once. My thoughts calmed and lessened, and I let myself be taken away. I rested in that state for some time before I awoke. My vision began focusing as the rest of me slowly came back to my previous state of awareness. I was surprised by what I saw. Nearly a quarter of the lizards had those hardened scales of the defender and strong light, and they were slightly larger than the rest. They had also expanded, and branched out into a few smaller groups, some heading into the forest, others farther down the shore. There was also something else different about them. In each of the communities, the lizards grouped together in family units of 2 to 5 lizards. One was always a slightly larger defender type, and there was at least one male and female per group. Some groups were split evenly between male and female, others more skewed. Although I didn't have a face, I could feel my essence smile. My lizards now not only had a sense of community, but also a concept of family. When the breeding season came, most stayed to their own family units to breed, and when the young were born, all members of the family unit helped raise the young, even after their scales had hardened. I felt like a proud parent. The influence from the defenders has greatly reshaped their society. I also felt a mild pang of regret as I had been unable to watch them get to this point. Amidst the family groups there were other groups without a defender. They seemed to be stragglers banded together, often young ones that had recently grown out of their family unit. Just like the family groups, they assisted one another, and when a young bachelor or bachelorette defender came of age, some would break off to form a family group with them. The defender had a very important place in the lizard society. They offered protection to their family, and the family provided for them. Seeing them form such close bonds with one another warmed my heart. The family units usually stayed to themselves, but when larger predators threatened the colony, the defenders would all band together to chase them off, protecting the community as a whole. That camaraderie was what I had hoped for. It was probably just as well that Stronglight had passed without a legacy. Her kin would have been too aggressive to serve the needed function of a protector. As time passed, not much changed within the societies. They branched out just a little farther into the forest and along the shore, but had reached a point of stagnation. Could it be that without my influence, the lizards couldn't adapt further? It was more likely that I just sped it along, but the thought stayed with me. By now, little lizards were practically born knowing the rock smashing technique, and it worked well on shelled sea urchin-like creatures for the shore groups. That technique hadn't been influenced by me, the little leader had thought it up on his own. I merely gave him a means to spread that knowledge. But that seemed to be where ingenuity ended. There were some that tried other ideas without success, so they never really moved forward after that. What could help them? The strong light that caused the harder-scaled and mildly larger lizards seemed like a freak accident. It was probably asking too much to hope another one would come along soon. I was finally starting to understand my role. To advance, they needed my guidance. And I wanted them to advance. I wanted them to want more for themselves, not to stagnate and hope for the best. They needed ingenuity. They needed more than just a rock, they needed tools. Tools. Where had that thought come from? It felt familiar, but I couldn't place it. I watched them use the rock, lifting it and smashing it down. I paid closer attention and saw they lifted it awkwardly. It was hard for them to get a good grip. That's why it often took a good amount of wax to get things open, as they didn't have much precision. I looked at their little scaled and clawed hands and imagined. Grip. Manual dexterity. Thumbs. It came to me like shock. An opposable thumb. It felt so incredibly nostalgic, I might have cried had I the eyes to do so. When I imagined my own hands, I felt they too had been like that. Memories tried to surge within me, but they were not strong enough to make it past the tar-like mud that encased them. The murk cut them off before I could glimpse them. It was the first time I wondered who I was. All this while I'd only been thinking of the lizards with no thought to myself. My current self, the overseer, I was just starting to understand. But my past self remained shrouded in mystery, just beyond my reach, save for the flash of an inspiration. Who was I? Where did I come from? How did I get here? All questions went unanswered. I was part of the world, but I was alone. I could not directly interact with lizards or anything else for that matter. Left unanswered, the thoughts eventually faded away. I didn't become hysterical, I may not even have been capable of such a thing. But I knew I would revisit those thoughts. Hopefully some clues would come next time. Perhaps influencing the lizards with my inspiration would help me remember. I hoped so. I hoped. Chapter 4, Family. After the experience of overexerting myself, I set about the idea of opposable thumbs in a different manner. I looked around for the lizards whose thumbs were a bit abnormal to start. I kept watching them, waiting for them to breed. When they did, I performed tiny little adjustments to their offspring, very small. It would be many generations before my design came to fruition, but doing such small touches over a long period of time was easier to handle. The development was slow, but certainly faster than it would have been, left to its own devices. It could even be that without my coaxing, it never would have happened to begin with. There was excitement in the waiting. Some generations continued to develop without direct influence, likely since I was urging them in that direction. I also urged the lightly thumbed ones to breed outside their normal groups, so that more offspring could help develop the strain. Even before the thumb was fully completed to my ideals, the lizards started making use of their changing hands. Their manual dexterity increased significantly, and gripping stones was much easier. Food was more abundant, since more could be cracked open with less time. They also started using the rocks on rotting wood to expose more delicious bugs. Those by the shore began diving into the shallow water during low tide, eager to catch the little shrimps and shelled creatures that drifted close to shore. Those in the forest used their more powerful hands to grip the bark and scuttle up the trunks of trees to get at prey hiding out of reach of the land predators. They were also very smart. I was incredibly proud of their advancement. With more abundant food came larger populations. The territories expanded yet again. I could see just a little farther along the shore, a little further into the trees. As their world expanded, so did mine. And once again they surprised me. The separate colonies, of which there were 8 now, stopped mingling between other colonies. They began to protect their territory from other colonies that might seek to take their food sources. I wasn't quite sure how I felt about that. One part of me felt it was natural, and just the way of the world. It made sense. If another colony started in on someone else's food source, their food would be depleted. Another part of me wept that they could not all get along. I wanted the camaraderie to exist between all the lizards, not just between those of the same colony. They did not have the intelligence for trade and rules, it was still all very basic. I did not know how to get them to understand that those of the same species were not enemies. I could only watch as they closed themselves off from each other. Would it really be better this way? Was this the direction they should take? If they had all gotten along, and learned to help their kin, would my people have fared better? There it was again. A mere wisp of a memory. My people. The memory wasn't a vision, it was a feeling. A feeling of a bleeding heart. That strife between brothers and sisters had ruined everything I held precious. The defenders knew the meaning of banding together to overcome larger enemies, but without those larger enemies, they turned on themselves. Out of greed or gluttony. Out of wanting to provide for their families at the cost of others. I didn't want that, not for them. It may be the way of the world, but I didn't want their world to be about warring against each other, stealing and defending what they thought to be theirs. Let them feel that way about the other species, but not each other. The thumbs I'd worked so hard on were so close to fruition. I had already seen the positive results of their development. But they would have to wait. I brought together every part of my essence that I could muster. I pulled back every piece of me that reached out to them, watched them, and heard them. And then I exploded. I washed over them, every single one of them in all 8 colonies. All of my being was devoted to a single thought. Family. You are all family, every single one of you. Your family extends beyond your family groups. Everyone is a brother, sister, father, mother, son, daughter. You are all more than a single piece, together you are whole. You are family. And then everything vanished. Chapter 5, What Lies at the End? It was black, it was nothingness. I barely had the capacity to realize I was conscious. I was so far away from everything. So very far away. I could just barely make out whispered sounds in the distance. Try as I might, I could not get closer. In fact, it felt like I was getting farther away. I was drifting into the abyss. Soon even the sound slipped away beyond my ability to perceive it. I was alone, disconnected from everything. There was nothing to stimulate my senses other than thought. It was the first time I had felt afraid. Likely, I was ceasing to be. Losing each of my senses one by one. Soon the thoughts would fade as well, and I could already feel them becoming weaker. Could I exist within absolute nothingness? I think not. Something inside me told me this was the end. The end. The end. I wished I could have seen them grow more. The greedy one was not them, it was me. The end. I hoped that my last act as their overseer helped them in all the trials and tribulations ahead. I knew family was important for that, like mine had been for me. Had I had a family once? The end. It would have been nice if I did. The end. Goodbye my lizards. The end. Will I see you strong light? The end. Little leader? The end. The end. The end? Chapter 6, Starlight. Light. A tiny light. A star, I thought. I drifted towards it. Always out of my reach, I drifted towards it. If I could just grasp it, what would happen? I did not know. I did not know, but I kept trying. It was out of my reach, but I was getting closer. I felt like if I could not get to the starlight, it would surely be the end of everything for me. The end? I felt like I had thought of that once, but could not remember where. There it was, I was almost there. It shone with a light of a million colors. I was dazzled, enraptured by it. I reached farther. Desperation pushed me, desire fueled me. I was so close. Starlight. The moment I touched it, my world flooded with color, sound, and memory. I had almost lost myself to the abyss. I now remembered everything, saw everything, heard everything. Just this small bit of starlight had saved me. But what was this starlight? Ah, I could see her, and she was beautiful. Her small lizard head looked towards the sky, not out of fear of a tall predator, or searching for flying prey. It was curiosity, awe. While the other lizards slept, she alone looked up at the stars and realized their wonder. It was like she was looking at me. I could feel my essence spread out to all the lizards, much as it had been before, but my attention was focused on her. I longed to weep, to laugh, to scream, to love. She had saved me, I knew. I could feel the feelings she felt. She believed in something. That something was what lived in the heart of all her people. The heart that told them they were all family. She believed in me, and I was able to exist again. I could not do much for her, I knew I was too weak. But I did reach out to her. I touched her heart. I gave her a feeling that said you are not alone. Although not enough to fully drain me, it was close. Conscious in my weakness, the flow of time felt slower. Starlight's life did not end as quickly for me as the little leaders or strong lights. I saw just how far they'd all come since I had fallen into the abyss. They had made tools. They chipped rocks to make them sharp, tied them to fallen branches with vines from the trees. A spear. The shore groups caught fish beyond just the edge of the water with the piercing weapon. It was easier to use the spear underwater than on land. They weren't bound to the earth on all fours in the buoyant sea. They could hold their breath and hang suspended underwater vertically or horizontally as they desired. They were also quite adept at swimming now. Holding their back legs tight against their tails, they undulated their strong tails to achieve a great amount of propulsion. The spears also made a difference with the land dwellers. They would walk on 3 legs, carrying the spear in one of their hands, and although primarily still quadrupedal, they would at times rest on their hind legs, sitting up. An image of a prairie dweller appeared in my mind. Another lost memory resurfaced, of a creature I did not know, but felt like I could remember. The lizards would sit up when aiming with their spears, or when confronted with a predator. Making themselves look bigger, and having the freedom to brandish the spear made for an intimidating foe that all but the largest predators avoided. The ability to sit on their legs also allowed them to look farther in the distance to spot predator and prey, and maintain balance when they cracked open shells with sharp rocks. Some even tried to walk bipedal, but it was awkward and floppy. I thought I would like to help them achieve that feat with more grace. It also felt familiar, just like when I had reshaped their hands. The forest dwellers were very adept at climbing trees now, and had long ago mastered the art of viewing in the distance by using the height of the tree. They used sharp stones to break off useful limbs from the upper branches to provide for the other lizards. I also noticed they did not come down to the ground as often, preferring to stay in the heights of the tall old trees. But what hardened me most of all lied at the heart of their colonies. Over time, I had seen many lizards become ill or crippled. They were left to die since they were too weak to provide for themselves. But now, the lizards around them provided for them if they could not, or comforted them with their company as they lived out the last of their days. They had scavenged off their dead before I had gone to Abyss, but now they seemed to hold them dear. They would take the dead to the shores and, with a hint of ceremony, give their dead to the sea, a watery burial. There seemed to be a group of lizards devoted to making the rock tools. They used blunt, rounded stones to shear off thick flakes of rocks with sharp edges. They even sharpened the edges of harder seashells. While many were attached to wooden branches with strong, thin vines, they also sharpened the edges of some of the branches into a point. Although not as powerful as the stone spears, the wood spears were easier and lighter for the young ones to handle and use. They were likely the predecessors of the stone-tipped spears. They had come very far. Their community shared with each other, protected each other, comforted each other. The family units of 2 to 5 were still prevalent, but the community itself was also one giant family. And all the colonies together were family. The combination of opposable thumbs, defenders, sharing, and rock smashing had all culminated into this over time. I was amazed. Indeed, these little lizards were capable of many things. Focusing my attention on Starlight, I saw that she was not yet a mother, but that time would soon come. Her colony was in the site of the original colony the little leader was from, between the shore colonies and forest colonies. She was not a defender type, but went out on food runs to collect bugs and bring them back to her colony. She also helped comfort the invalids and the old. She was in a straggler unit, not yet part of a family unit, and while all the other lizards slept, she would always stay up later into the night and gaze at the stars. After watching her and the others for several day and night cycles, I realized something new about my little lizards. Sometimes they would look at each other, and their dark scales would shimmer with color, not because light had hit them in a certain way, but a deliberate patterned flash of color. Communication existed in their community now. Their communication was basic, simple things like take, stop, do, good, bad. They would shimmer, sometimes accompanied by minute movements of their long and thin, whip-like tails. Starlight often shimmered at night, perhaps trying to communicate with the stars that twinkled and shone in the distance, her tail swaying questioningly. Perhaps to communicate with me. I wished I could respond. Chapter 7, The Life of a Lizard. The tree-dwelling lizards used holes in the trees for their family units, sometimes carving out the hole themselves with sharp rocks. But for the ground and shore colonies, the shining black rock of their home was pockmarked with a myriad of holes in which to make a family home, so there always seemed to be plenty of room. When holes became scarce, they broke off into new colonies rather than overcrowding the current colony. Starlight eventually found a female defender to form a family unit with, and 2 other males from a straggler unit joined in before their family solidified. The time of her being a mother was near, and while I could not influence her children as I had done with her ancestors, I was still excited to see the little ones. I wondered if they'd share her sense of wonder. Starlight's family hole bordered the forest. It was convenient for food, but required the defender to be more on guard against predators hiding among the trees. I enjoyed the interactions of the family unit, each playing their part in society. Starlight and one of the males did food runs for the colony, and the other male helped appropriate food to the weaker members. The defender, true to her name, helped defend the borders of the colony. During the next mating season, she was taken by both males, as was the female defender. The two males brought protective and heat-incubating foliage to decorate the hole with. Once the eggs hatched, the dead foliage would be removed so it didn't mold in their little hole. The extra warmth provided by the foliage was perfect for growing eggs, and after hatching, sharing body heat among the family was plenty warm enough. A number of weeks passed before Starlight and the other female laid their eggs on top of the foliage bedding. Starlight clutched 5 eggs, impressive for a first clutch. The defender clutched 2, which was normal as the defender females generally clutched less than their smaller counterparts. A defender could not be overburdened with eggs and still be able to defend her family. They all tended the eggs as they continued to grow. The incubation period outside the mother's belly was longer than in, and the eggs doubled in size by the time they were ready to hatch. Most of them anyway. 2 of Starlight's and 1 of the defender's eggs became discolored over time, indicating the unborn had not made it through development. It was a common occurrence, but no less saddening. After the hatchlings emerged, the discarded shells were removed from the family hole and the discolored eggs were taken to the water. The parents all shared a moment of sorrow before pushing the discolored eggs into the water, and sought each other for comfort. The 4 hatchlings were raised by all 4 family members. Physical contact in the form of nose bumping and cuddling along with affectionate scale shimmers conveyed their love to their young and each other. As their scales hardened, the young were encouraged to mingle with the community, and they were taught many things by their extended family, like how to shimmer their scales for certain messages, and how to catch prey. Before full dark, the family units would return to their holes and huddle close together for warmth against the cold night. Starlight still sat outside her hole every night to look at the stars until it became too cold and she was forced to retreat back to her family. I cherished every moment she spent out there. Although alone among her peers, she was not truly alone, as I was there with her. I felt a kinship with her, as I also saw the wonder of the stars, shining beautifully in the night sky. I hoped the other lizards would one day know the beauty of the night. Perhaps it was selfish longing, hoping they would look at the stars so that I could feel they looked at me. Starlight was a good mother to the 4 children, as well as the community's children. She took to task teaching the young about smells. Her scales flashed light green and blue along her sides for good smells, yellow and orange along her back for bad smells. The young copied her and practiced for days until they could manage the appropriate shimmers. All the young were born knowing how to shimmer their scales, and emotions such as happiness, fear, sadness, and anger were natural. Learning the words of the shimmers was more involved and took much practice. One day, Starlight's family unit took a group of youngsters out into the woods to show them nearby food sources their colony used, places Starlight and 1 of the males frequented often on their food runs. She showed them how to use their clawed fingers to get at the shallow roots of plants where ground bugs liked to feed and breed. It took a certain amount of dexterity to get at the bugs without uprooting and killing the plant, which the youngsters still worked to improve. A lucky few managed to round up some bugs on their own, and ate them as a reward. Starlight and the 2 males made sure the others didn't go hungry and appropriated them with food as well. As they moved on to the next feeding ground, I was witness to something disastrous. A huge, long, snake-like creature dropped down from the tall trees into the middle of the young, quickly snatching one for a meal. The great snake creature was a dark green with mottling of a reddish-brown, like the bark of the tall trees. The adults flashed colors of danger and bad, and the defender rushed in with her spear to drive away the monster. Calls from deep in their gullet sounded a warning to any other lizards that might be nearby. This was the first time any of the young had encountered a predator, and some panicked. A couple of the panicked ones became another morsel for the snake monster with its whip-fast attacks. The defender hissed at the predator, flashing her scales in warning, a yellow color that ran from her tail up to her head in an endless loop. She jabbed her spear towards the giant snake, and the snake monster responded by unfurling its sharp fangs, hissing back at the defender. As large as the defender was, she would still only be a mouthful for the great snake. It had likely lived a long time for how large it was, which meant it was either very lucky or very crafty. To get past the forest colonies without them raising alarm was certainly a crafty feat. The snake monster bobbed its head back and forth, striking with feints and lunging with blows. It would wiggle its tail to draw attention, then attack as the defender looked towards the source of movement. The young adult defender would be lucky to make it out alive. Between jabs with her spear, she would also whip her body around to strike with her long, hard tail like a whip. It was a careful dance between the two, the defender slowly losing ground as she kept her distance back. For all her practice, the learned movements with the spear were no match for the speed of the snake's natural coil and strike attacks and experience of age. Meanwhile, Starlight and her males gathered up the other young and ran back to the colony. She looked back, seeing her family member being attacked by the great snake, bleeding from cuts, but remaining defiant. She cried out from her gullet for her beloved, her scaled shimmering with concern. Between the looping flashes of warnings, there was a shimmer of affection, and a word shimmer for go. Starlight returned to the young, keeping a watch behind even after they were out of view, partly to keep an eye out for danger, but mostly to see if her family member came back to them. A few defenders met them closer to the colony, hearing the warning cries from Starlight's group. 2 escorted the group back to the colony proper while 5 more ran to the scene of battle to protect their colony sister. They had lost 4 of the young to the giant snake. By the time the sky was darkening, 3 defenders returned, but not Starlight's. They gave off flashes for danger and alive, so the snake monster was merely warded off, not killed. The colony family mourned their losses with no bodies to put to water. Having no defender, Starlight's family was placed with a family unit of 2 and their 2 young ones, merging their families together that night. Her defender had been brave, and thanks to her many of the young still lived. A noble sacrifice. While not overly common, there were still many defenders that lost their lives protecting the colony. But Starlight still mourned, long into the night. She asked the stars, asked them where, shimmering and flashing with emotions of sadness. But they never answered back. And for my part, I was helpless but to watch it all happen. There was nothing I could do for her or anyone in my current state. I couldn't even offer comfort or condolences. The sadness of every lizard flowed through me, and I wept for each loss, though I had no tears. I could not protect them, not from predators nor the sadness in their hearts. Powerless, that's how I felt. My essence was massive enough to be with every lizard, and yet it felt so very small. Starlight didn't come out the next night, nor the night after that. It became apparent she would no longer return to gaze upon the starlit sky. It made me feel lonely and abandoned. It was like she spoke to me when she came out at night and shimmered to the sky, though I could not answer her. But now, no longer. The night felt darker with her absence. She and her males were very understandably heartbroken, and although part of a new family, they did not share the same connection with them as they did with their defender. The other 2 families that had lost their defender fared about the same. A message was sent to the forest colonies, warning them of the massive predator, one that was not easily scared away. Hunts were organized, sometimes with the defenders of Starlight's colony. It struck one of the forest colonies and Starlight's colony once more during Starlight's lifetime. They were never able to kill it. Starlight eventually went back to her routine of food runs for the colony and teaching the young her trade and signals related to food gathering. She could not mourn forever, and though one of her family was gone, she still had her males, children, and new family that were still alive. Her children grew, and she raised many successful clutches after that. Her bonds with her 2 males grew deeper, and she eventually bred with the male defender of her new family unit and after a time warmed up to the female. My sense of time was returning, taking me away from the focus on Starlight and her family. The seasons passed, and I remained a passive watcher. Finally, Starlight entered the last phase of her life, living among the old and invalids. I saw her in all of her children and grandchildren, her legacy would live on long after she was gone. And then one night, she came out of her hole and looked once more to the stars. It was like my own time had stopped, all my attention focused on that single moment. She had come back to the stars. Her shimmering was weak with old age, but she managed to speak to the stars for a short time. They said take. My heart cried out to her, she hadn't abandoned me, hadn't forgotten about me. Even if it was to the stars, the one who heard her was me. Of course I would take her. I would take all my memories of her and keep them safe so that she may live on in my heart, just as the little leader, Strong Light and countless unnamed lizards did. I would take them all unto myself. Then she laid down under the starry sky she had loved so much, and never woke up. Chapter 8, Waiting. Death came to all things, and I wondered if I was capable of dying. Had I died once? Was I dead in the black abyss of nothing? Was I dead before that? Was I dead now? More questions with no answers. I felt alive through my lizards, lived vicariously through them. As long as they were alive, I was alive. I chose to believe that of myself. Starlight had shown me the power of belief. Each of their lives was like a tiny pinpoint of light. Small, minuscule, just one of 100,000 others that had come before it and the uncountable number that would follow. They lit up the sky of my essence like a countless number of stars, each shining with their own light. A portion of my essence was dedicated to remembering all those small lights of life that had passed. Their lives encouraged me forward. For all the sadness at their passing, the birth of every new light delivered just as much happiness. It would be quite some time before I felt fully rested. My influence was weak, but even so I did not want their growth to stagnate. They had come a long way in the time I was absent, using all the gifts I had given them, combining them with their own genius. For now, I focused on the issue of their legs. Seeing Starlight's defender fight, although admirable in her own way, was hampered by her quadrupedal posture. To get a good grip on her spear, she had to sit on her back legs, wasting precious seconds and making her more vulnerable while she attacked. When jabbing while balancing on 3 legs, she couldn't get the same amount of force, but had more mobility. I could see this being problematic in their future. The creatures around them did not remain static, they too grew and changed with the generations, adapting to their predators and prey. Protecting their families was a high priority, for them and for me. Although their forelegs were a bit weaker, overall their short legs were well suited for quadrupedal movement. When sitting, they sat back on their feet with their heels on the ground, and had difficulty rising from their knees while in that position. That would become key to forward movement. Their legs needed strength to hold their body upright, to move without the assistance of their forelegs. When sitting on their back legs, their heels should be raised so they could easily change positions. Their center of balance would also need to be drawn more towards their hips, or they would just topple forward as they did now, though not fully as they had a tail to help counterbalance. How did I know this? This didn't come in the flash of a memory, it felt much more familiar than that. It was almost as if I just knew, despite the creatures in the area walking on 6, 4, or no limbs. I did not see any 2-legged creatures in the area of my lizards, yet I instinctively knew how to move on 2 legs. Bodiless, I could not even imagine myself with 2 legs. I would not worry about where the knowledge came from for now, I would simply use it to my advantage. Perhaps one day I would revisit the question, along with the countless others. With the young eggs I very slowly gave strength to their legs. It was such a minuscule amount, much less than when I was reshaping their hands. It would be a long endeavor, but I was up to the challenge. I wanted my lizards to be able to defend themselves from all their predators, not just most. I did not hold a hatred towards the giant snake, it was simply living as it ought. No, this was my problem to overcome, to strengthen their weaknesses so they would not fall prey again to such strong foes. My thinking was more defensive than offensive. I didn't want them to barbarically subjugate all others, but I also did not wish for them to be subjugated either. Was I being too willful, pushing my ideals onto these creatures that had only recently learned to think for themselves? I dwelled upon that for a long time, all the while still nurturing the changes in their limbs. Strong Light's birth had been due to my own curiosity, not for the good the lizards. Influencing the little leader, surely that had benefited their development. Their strong sense of family, purely my own selfish whim. Yet I did not regret it, any of it. My lizards were still growing and developing, perhaps I was too. Would it be that as they advanced, so too would I? More questions, and very few answers. I could only hope that I was leading them on the right path. Perhaps they would guide me much in the same way I guided them. I think I would like that. I felt myself shimmer with affection for them, my ways of thinking influenced by the way my lizards communicated. Now it was time to wait. Wait for them to develop, wait for new inspiration, wait for something new to occur. I would watch and wait. Chapter 9, Retrogression. It had been a while, but the shift towards bipedal was going smoothly. I realized somewhat belatedly that their long bodies and short legs might be a bit awkward when going fully bipedal, so I also began lengthening their limbs to compensate. All in all, it was going well, and I was proud of the progress. There were sometimes bright lights that occurred during the breeding season, but I largely ignored them for my current project. But then came one that I couldn't ignore. Or rather, two. Almost all of the brighter lights had something that made them different than their fellows. Most of the time, those differences made them weak, unable to function properly, and those that actually made it to the eggs often died without intervention. Not every change resulted progress. But these two were different, stronger. They both shone in the same way, so both would exhibit the same adaptation, I was certain. Appropriately, it occurred in one of the shore colonies. Releasing my influence on the rest of the young that were developing bipedal legs, I used my influence to see that these two lights successfully fertilized eggs, and hatched without problems. Attempting something a little more draining, for the sake of their future legacy, I tweaked something very small within both of them. Fertility. When the brother and sister were born, I was filled with a sense of excitement the likes of which I hadn't been in a very long time. I knew from their lights how they would look, but actually seeing the pair was quite the joyous occasion. To the other lizards, they looked fairly normal, and the difference was not as immediately obvious as when the defenders had first been born. But if one took a closer look towards the base of their shoulders, there appeared bits of exposed flesh on either side of their lower necks. It was like their scales had cracked, or been rent open by a predator. The fleshy bits were sensitive, but as long as they took care, I didn't foresee them experiencing any major problems in the foreseeable future. The real moment of truth came after their scales hardened and they started learning to swim from their family. They took to the water as easily as the other young born to the shore colonies, all well suited to swimming. They naturally locked their legs back, using their tail for propulsion. Ah, I could see it now. Water washed over the exposed flesh at their necks. The flesh had small, shallow folds, allowing water into the crevices. The two stayed underwater almost twice as long as their colony siblings. Able to draw about half a breath of air directly from the water before having to return to the surface. I was certain in their prehistory, before I came to them, they had once been water-dwelling creatures. They were simply returning to it. The two would be the start of something new for the lizards. They swam in the water now, but it was not their domain, they were merely visitors. But that exposed flesh would eventually become something more, an organ that could process the water the way lungs processed the air. The name came to me, a word from memory, gills. They weren't true gills yet, but they would be. My heart filled with a yearning. Gills had been beyond the realm of my people, cutting us off from the depths of the water but for the barest glimpse. My people. Another memory of them resurfaced. They were a people without gills, who did not consider all of their fellows as family. That was the limit of my knowledge of them. Even so, I held those two pieces close, they were all I had. I would give the lizards what my people never had. I would give them the land, the trees, the sea, the sky. Their family would reach the highest heights and the deepest depths. They would not be limited, they would be free. The two somewhat gilled lizards proliferated the shore colony with their young. The male was one of the few that bred outside his family unit, likely due to his enlarged libido. The female typically had clutches around 8 eggs, nearly all of them surviving incubation. The change in their fertility had been the right choice. The more it spread, the more adapted they would become to life in the water. I came to another realization about their children. For their descendants, I would forego the shift to bipedal. In order to master the water, they would need a different focus. Not only improvement to the pseudo-gills, they would need to be able to move easily in the water, and see in the dark depths. I thought it would be more difficult to concurrently nurture two different traits within two sets of the lizards, but was surprisingly only mildly impactful. The retrogression would take some time before living in the water full-time could be achieved, the bipedal shift would likely be done before then. The heels of the lizards had already elongated to the point that they could squat forward, resting on the balls of their feet, the heel lifted in the air. A surprising side effect of the change was their ability to leap. They had already been capable of jumping, but with the moderately strengthened legs and improved posture, the leaps were quite amazing to behold. I felt they would end up very athletic at this rate. The forest-dwelling lizards also adapted well to the change in leg structure. To work with tools before, they'd have rest on a limb to be able to sit, but with the increased strength, their grip seemed to increase as well, and they could now hold onto the trunks with just their back legs while working on other things with their hands. They were all advancing well. I was also certain I was advancing. My thoughts seemed more complicated, more attention paid to minute details, my influence branching into many different areas. But at the same time I felt like I was missing something. There was a disconnect. When was the last time I had thought of them as my lizards? For all that I was connected to each and every one of them, there was a wall that separated us. Where did this wall come from? How did it get there? Why did I only notice it now? How strange! Were the lizards cutting me off somehow? That didn't make sense, they didn't even know I was here. A great pang resounded throughout my essence at that thought, and the wall between us vibrated. Ah, I knew the answer now. I created that wall. Chapter 10, 100,000 million stars. Since Starlight's passing, I had pulled back from my lizards. I still loved them all, and paid much attention to their advancement, but my heart was closed off. I hadn't given names to any lizards since. Perhaps I was mourning without being aware of it. Was I afraid of becoming too attached to individual lizards again? I had been attached to the little leader and strong light, but their passing was natural, and although saddened, I wasn't overly affected by it like with Starlight. I now knew I had a rift somewhere in my essence. I had closed it off, rejected its existence, and thus not even realized it was there, and erected a wall to keep myself from seeing it. The rift had eyes, and it stared at me, unblinking. I was afraid of that rift. I had been through so much emotion in Starlight's lifetime, so many lizard lifetimes ago, and I was afraid to be overwhelmed with their return. I'm sure that's what laid in that rift. Should I let it sit there, unattended? Would the rift inside me grow worse if I ignored it, or just go away? It was a bitter internal struggle. I didn't know how to feel, and had no one to confide in. Now that I saw it, or it saw me, I could feel myself being drawn into that rift. A feeling of loneliness consumed me. Ah, I was lonely. With no one else talking to the stars at night, I was alone again. There was no one to acknowledge my existence. It was scary, mind-numbing. I desired communication so desperately, to give some validity to my own shapeless existence. I hadn't realized how alone I was until I found Starlight, and had never quite gotten over her loss. How I wished I could be the stars to speak with her, how I had deluded myself thinking she spoke to me, when all she actually saw were the twinkling stars in the sky. I descended in a perilous spiral in an unending loop of negativity and fright and helplessness. Grief. Loneliness. Doubt. I had fallen into the dark rift, a hole inside my own existence. Here existed all my unanswered questions, all my failings, all my unfulfilled desires, all the things I could not have and could not be. It was dark and unending. It ate away at myself, I ate away at myself. I wanted to save them when they were hurt. You cannot save them. I wanted to embrace them when they were sad. You cannot touch them. I wanted to talk and communicate with them. You cannot speak to them. I wanted someone to know I was here. No one knows you're here. You are alone. You are hollow. You do not exist. I was dead inside. Dead outside. Death was everywhere. No, it was nowhere. I was nowhere. It ate at everything I was, leaving nothing left. It was darker than the abyss I had been lost in. I hadn't wanted to fade, but would have been content with the decision I made back then. But here, I wanted it to stop. I wanted it to end. I wanted it to be over. I don't want to feel like this anymore. I don't want to think anymore. I don't want to be here. Help me. A light. A pale, small light. It floated down to me, ever so gently, in my dark rift. It had a voice in this voiceless place. I held on to it. And it spoke to me. You are not alone. The words I had entrusted to Starlight. It was Starlight I held in my hands. Her memory that lived on in me. She heard me, and she had come to me. Another pale light appeared in the distance. It called out to me. Another light, it spoke to me. Another light, it sang to me. Another light, it shimmered to me. All around me, lights came to life, all the small lights I had cherished, all the lights I had remembered. And there were new lights, lights of the living that called out to me. They came to me one by one, filling up my dark rift with 100,000 million stars. It was a great web that connected every single star to each other, and at their center, was me. They knew me. I was their family heart. I was the existence that tied them all together. Their pain was my pain. My pain was their pain. Their happiness was my happiness. My happiness was their happiness. We were all connected, we were all one. I was one of them, and they knew me. The lights of the stars shattered the rift I had made around myself, shattered the wall I had put up to separate myself from them, shattered the emptiness that had threatened to consume me, and shattered any doubt that I was alone. I wasn't alone. I was never alone, they were always here with me. As